Hey, what's going on, guys? Today I just want to make a quick video talking about infusions versus buffs. Also want to touch on fire and lightning infusions versus keen and heavy infusions. If you do want to know about weapon buffs themselves and my thoughts on them, I did make a whole dedicated video towards that and as ranking them all, so feel free to check that out. I'll just link it down in the description. But as for now, though, at least, I do want to talk about sorcery and incan scaling and how it doesn't really matter when it comes to weapon buffs. Also, it doesn't really matter when it comes to healing spells as well. But what I mean by this is that the weapon buffs only really scale off your faith and or intelligence scaling and your stat as well. So for instance, when I use something like the Frenzied Flame Seal, which has a higher incan scaling than the Godslayers, but a lower faith scaling, as you can see, the damage that I'll get is 596, but when I switch off back to the Godslayer Seal, which has a higher faith scaling but lower incan scaling, I'm actually going to be doing higher damage. So proof that the incan scaling doesn't really matter. Same thing as the sorcery scaling, pretty much works the exact same way. One other thing is that the Graven talismans and the Canvas talismans don't really matter as well. So as you can see, have it equipped, still going to be doing the same amount of damage. And one thing is that the attack rating is not the only thing I'm going to be worrying about. I'm going to be focusing on damage numbers themselves. I was doing testing on Stephen the Omen, good old reliable, my guy. He's always there for my damage testing. If you do want to know about his damage absorption numbers, I'll probably just have it up on screen. I didn't really touch on slash or holy damage at all. Didn't want to skew the numbers in any way. But yeah, that's the way. Let's get right into it. Okay, time for the damage numbers that I've once again shamelessly put into a Google Doc because I'm not bothered to do video editing because it's incredibly fucking boring. Anyway, the Lord Sworn Straight Sword was my weapon of choice for these damage testing, as well as only using the dexterity and or faith stat. This does not mean it does not apply to strength or intelligence. They literally translate over perfectly fine as long as you're using like the same weapons and or staff. They're definitely applicable to both. So when you use something like the Electrify Armament, which was my spell buff of choice, the Magic Armament is pretty much exactly the same, and Magic Infusion is pretty much the intelligence version of a Flame Art Infusion. So do take it with a grain of salt, because obviously every single build is not going to have the same numbers, but they're definitely going to translate over perfectly fine. And with this type of testing, it still is going to find out exactly what we need in terms of the difference between spell buffs and infusions themselves. But before I do get into it, it is only going to apply for weapons that cannot be infused. So when I talk about this, I'm only talking about weapons that cannot be infused. Anyway, 45 Dex and 45 Faith was the first build of which I tested. You pretty much use this type of build when you have like a balanced type of gameplay with melee combat mixed in with spell combat, obviously. 448 damage was what I was doing with just a regular keen infusion without a buff. 629 damage with the keen infusion with a spell buff, which was Electrify Armament, which, spoilers, was actually the highest damage number I actually got throughout all the testing. 572 with the Flame Art Infusion. As for the damage numbers themselves, so against Stephen the Omen, 352 without the buff, 456 with the spell buff, and 401 with a Flame Art Infusion. I probably recommend going with the spell buff, being that it's still like a considerable amount over the Flame Art. Obviously, you have to keep buffing it over and over again, which can get a bit of tedious, but I think that extra damage you do get is probably worth it, unless you're just not the type to forget with using buffs over and over again, but it's definitely worth that extra bit of damage. Now, time for the 30-60 stat split. I wouldn't really recommend using this stat split unless you had a weapon with higher requirements, because you're not really benefiting much off that 30 dex or strength that you are using. But if you do have a weapon with a higher requirement just to meet that requirement, then that's perfectly fine to run that amount. But in most cases, if you don't have a higher requirement, you're better off going into faith or intelligence and just going with just a flame art or magic infusion. But looking at the numbers themselves, they are lower all across the board, but the spell buff is going to be the one with doing the most damage. But it's not that much more, as you can see, the damage numbers themselves. Flame Art's just a little bit lower, so you're probably better off going with this, being that it's consistently this amount of damage. You don't have to constantly rebuff over and over again, but you're better off going all into Faith. So yeah, only time you would actually have this stat split is if you have to meet a minimum requirement for a weapon. Okay, time for the 60-30 stat split. Now this one is the type of build you use when you're primarily doing melee-based combat and you don't really want to use that many spells. Probably want to use like one to kite enemies in, like a ranged spell, use like a spell-based buff. It's mainly more popular with faith-based builds, being that when you have 30 faith, you open yourself up to a bunch of different types of spells like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, a bunch of different damage absorption spells, health regen spells as well. But this type of build with 30 intelligence is not really that great. But looking at the damage numbers themselves, Surprisingly, it's actually less than what you get with a 45-45 split. It's the exact same damage number though, but it's still going to be the best option, obviously. One other thing to note as well is that without the buff, it's actually doing more damage than the infusion itself, and that's because it's going through two different types of defenses. With this number right here, you're doing both physical and fire damage, hence why you're just going to be a bit lower, doing two different types of damages. Whereas this one is just pure physical damage, hence why it's going to be a little bit higher. But with that 60 dexterity is why you're doing more physical damage. But I don't really recommend using this type of stat split because the 45-45 was doing just as much as this, and you're having more faith and or intelligence, so you get more spell damage on top of that as well, which is definitely more beneficial, in my opinion, based on how spells work in this game and how good they are. Okay, for pure faith or pure intelligence-based builds, having 80. With the Lord Sworn Straight Sword with a standard infusion, it's definitely the Flame Art infused and or Magic infused is going to be the best option. It's doing the most damage, and you don't have to constantly rebuff it over and over again. Obviously, this damage is lower across the board compared to all the other ones, but the main point of using this type of build is because you're going to be using nothing but spells and having your primary weapon as a secondary option. So yeah, you're just best off using the Flame Art infusion or Magic infusion, even Sacred infusion as well, for this type of build. Okay, now time to talk about the Fire and Lightning infusions versus the Heavy and Keen infusions. Did test it with just Dexterity, but once again, it translates directly to the Strength and Fire based builds as well. They're pretty much exactly the same and how they work. So if you flipped it over, it'd pretty much be exactly the same numbers. So at 45 Dexterity though, once again using the Lord Sworn Straight Sword, with a Keen infusion without the buff, 448 damage. With a Grease buff, which gives you plus 85, 533, and with the Lightning infusion is going to be 528. When you look at the damage numbers themselves, the one with the Grease buff is going to be higher, but not that much higher compared to the Lightning infusion, which I'd rather just have at this 45 Dexterity, because you don't have to constantly rebuff it or use Grease over and over again. So it's definitely a lot better at a lower type of stat. However, at 80 Dexterity or 80 Strength, I feel like it's better to just not go with a Lightning or Fire infusion. As you can see, the one of the Grease buff is going to be doing a lot higher damage, and look at the damage numbers themselves. The one without the buff is going to be doing more the one with the Lightning infusion. And once again, as I was saying before, it's because you have to go through two different defenses. This is going to do split physical and lightning damage, where this one is just going to be doing pure physical damage, so it only has to go through one layer of defense, hence why it just does more damage. But in conclusion, to wrap it all up, in terms of the Fire and Lightning builds, if you're running 80 Dex or Strength, I'd rather have Heavy and Keen compared to the Lightning and Fire. However, if you had lower Dex or Strength, I'd probably rather have the Lightning and Fire infusions, because as you can see, at 45, they're right neck and neck that I'd just rather have this one consistently. As for the rest of them though, it pretty much went the exact same way that I expected. So at 80 Faith or 80 Intelligence, the infusion was actually ended up being the best. But the buffs pretty much were just the best throughout the rest of them. One thing that did surprise me though, is that the 60-30 split was pretty much the exact same as the 45-45 split. So I'd rather just go with this every single time, because you're going to be doing more spell damage on top of all of that. Yes, your main weapon damage without the buff is going to be lower, but it's not that much lower in most cases anyway. So I'd rather just have a 45-45 split. Obviously, depending on what type of build, but 99% of the time, I'd rather have this. Once again, this is only taking into account weapons that cannot, or that can be infused, not talking about weapons that cannot be infused at all. But yeah, that pretty much concludes it for this one. If I did miss anything, or you guys want to add on to the top of this, please just leave it down in the comments below, and we'll talk about it there. But yeah, that's it for this one, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you in the next.